School-wide positive behavior support, SWPBS, and applied behavior analysis, ABA, are two of the most well-known approaches to delivery of behavioral services. Greatly influenced by applied behavior analysis, positive behavior support has become a topic of debate. Are these two approaches one and the same? Are they loosely connected, or are they vastly different from one another? SWPBS is an applied example of behavioral theory. PBIS meets each of the 5 features used to define applied behavior analysis: applied and behavioral, analytical and conceptual, technological, affective, and generality. Many argue that SWPBS is best described as an instance of behavior analysis. However, as others have argued that elements of SWPBS, including person-centered planning, wraparound mental health supports, self-determination, prevention science, and implementation science, include elements that are not yet validated through behavioral sciences like ABA is. Today, you will hear the two sides of this debate. Jennifer and myself will be the provers for Team A, supporting the relationship of SWPBS and ABA being similar due to the similarities between research-based principles, strategies, and individual group contingencies. Jennifer will also be the stater for Team A. Tara and Nicole will debate the other side as the attackers for Team B, claiming that the relationship between ABA and SWPBS is not the same because SWPBS does not utilize the most effective and evidentially supported interventions. At this time, Jennifer will begin the opening statement supporting the similarity between the two, and then Tara will share the opening statement for the counter argument from Team B.
Hi, I'm Jenny. I'm going to discuss the use of school-wide positive behavior supports and how they relate to ABA. So many people consider positive behavior supports, PBS, as a watered-down version of applied behavior analysis. The argument is not that PBS is one and the same with ABA, but very similar. PBS uses research-based principles and strategies like positive reinforcement and individual group contingencies that derive from ABA. PBS is an approach to using ABA in a massive population of school children to create a positive and proactive school environment. Now to you, Tara.
While PBS may have taken elements from behavioral principles, we argue that PBS and ABA are not one and the same. We believe that PBS is a relatively new field that has drawn influence from multiple different areas of social science and therefore is not conceptually consistent with ABA. The PBS model lacks safeguards that protect clients and practitioners. These safeguards are found in ABA and are protected by the BACB Code of Ethics. PBS does not lend to generality of skills, nor does it take into consideration the knowledge of skilled practitioners who have been educated in behavioral interventions. Now Jenny is going to move on to her arguments.
Positive behavior supports is an initiative in schools that applies principles and strategies derived from applied behavior analysis to prevent problem behaviors by analyzing the function of the behavior, teaching behavioral expectations, and reinforcing alternative behaviors appropriate in the school environment. PBS is a multi-tiered framework that focuses on measurable outcomes, evidence-based practices, implementation practices, and data for decision-making. So really quickly, I'm going to go over the tiers with everyone. Right, so as you can see here, PBS is a 3-tiered system. About 80% of the students in schools are going to fall in the first tier, the bottom one. And this tier is usually academic, behavioral, social. This is going to be 80% of the students. Students that are struggling in tier 1 move to tier 2. This is secondary prevention. It's going to be about the 15% of the population. Students, again, who are struggling with group pullouts or specific things that they're working on, mostly in groups, will move to tier 3, which are going to be more individualized supports for each student. Tier 3 is going to be about 5% of the population. Really quickly, I just want to talk about the PBS elements. In the elements, we have our outcomes, and we're going to ways that we support the staff and behavior, supporting student behavior, and supporting decision making. We do this with our systems, our data, and our practices. So during this discussion, I'm going to interchange positive behavior supports interventions, positive behavior intervention supports, PBIS, school-wide behavioral supports, that's SWPBS, and PBS, positive behavior supports. So you might hear that interchange throughout. So my first argument, I'm going to discuss how PBS is an alternative to addressing behavior in a positive manner compared to first resorting to punishment or punitive measures like detention or suspension. Similar to ABA, it aligns with the BACV Ethical Code 4.08 considerations regarding punishment procedures. This code 4.08 states that behavior analysts recommend reinforcement before any punishment is possible. Code 4.08 clarifies that if any punishment procedures are used, then the behavior analyst, or in this case of PBS, school staff reinforce alternative behaviors in the behavior change program. The Northeast Foundation of Children describes PBS as an application of behavioral analysts. PBIS focuses on teaching children positive behaviors and changing children's environment so that using positive behaviors become more effective for them than using negative behaviors. The article continues, adding that PBS recognizes that punitive or the get tough strategies can be counterproductive and are harmful to children. The first core ethical principle of behavior analysis is doing no harm. The Northeast Foundation of Children continues stating that, emphasizing that the punitive measures ultimately causes harm to others and that PBS measures are the best to see behavior change. Interventions and strategies commonly used in PBS that are used in ABA include positive reinforcement of appropriate behaviors, differential reinforcement of other behaviors or alternative behaviors, individual and group contingencies, individual and group contracts, variations of token economies, and so much more. For my next argument, I'm going to discuss how data is greatly used in PBS. So PBS focuses on behavior change. However, how can we see a change without the data? PBS, as with ABA, rely heavily on data and identifying the function behavior in order to address the behavior and see a behavior change. Implementing PBS is a thorough process and requires many steps. The implementation is broken into several phases. To address this argument of data collection and identifying the function behavior, phase 1 of PBS will be analyzed. Phase 1, the exploration and readiness agreement, looks at what needs to be considered before implementing PBS. This phase analyzes what the problem is, what the data to use the problem to address the problem, and what evidence-based practices address the problem. This assessment and analysis prior to implementing the behavior change program follows under the BACB Ethical Code 3.01 that assessments are conducted prior to making recommendations and when developing a behavior change program. Anderson and Kincaid mention data collection used in PBS and how school analyze data through discipline referrals and performance data. Constant monitoring and ongoing data collection are utilized using the data to make informed behavioral decisions. So really quickly, I just want to talk about how the implementation of PBS, particularly in Tier 1, they look at the number of office referrals. So as you can see in this graph by Page Middle School, they had 3 different years of PBS implementation. In the first year, you could see through the different months how PBS was relatively high, and then it gradually decreases. And you can see between 2011, 2012, and 2012, 2013, it kind of fluctuates. But in 2013, 2014, we could see a vast reduction in those years. In January, I believe that's when they formulated this graph, so that's why you don't see any data afterwards. But you're able to see, get a visual analysis of what PBIS looks when it's implemented in the school. So let me go back. And I want to go more into depth, not just in Tier 1, but in Tier 2 and Tier 3. In Tier 2 and Tier 3, data is used to drive instruction and intervention decisions. These decisions ensure that students have access to the same education in the least restrictive environment possible. Using data, the PBS team make decisions and recommendations based on the student's needs and suggest appropriate interventions that are research and evidence-based. These interventions are tailored to the individual's unique behaviors, environmental variables, and goals of the student. This aligns to the BACB Ethical Code 4.03 Individualized Behavior Change Program. Progress monitoring is heavily weighed on during the Tier 2 and Tier 3 process. It requires frequent and accurate measures of progress. Progress monitoring and these tiers measure student growth, judgments and intervention effectiveness, and determine how and when to continue, adjust, or discontinue an intervention. There are several ways to collect data during progress monitoring. There are direct behavior ratings, direct observations, and intervention-based measurements are possible options, and there's many more that you can use. Here are a few examples of data collection. And again, let me share. All right, so here you're going to see a direct behavior rating, or a DBR, which is completely directly observed after in a session. And the behaviors are going to be operationally and measurably defined and rated on a scale of 0 to 10. So on this particular data sheet, they're addressing academically engaged, respectfulness, and disruptive. And on the bottom of the sheet, they define each of the behaviors. The observer is going to rate how the student performed for each behavior from 0 to 10. So whether they did very well or did they struggle in that area. So it's going to probably be more of an elementary student. The next sheet is, again, the same idea. It's just wording, so it might be for an older student. For this sheet, this is the direct observation data. This particular one is a time sampling. So during a 15-minute interval, they're going to mark a plus or a negative whether the student engaged in that behavior during that time. This direct observation data is the frequency data, and they're just marking whether the student engaged in that behavior or not. This is intervention-based measurement, which is simply data collected within the intervention. This will include self-evaluation or behavior point sheets. So during reading, did the student raise his hand or did he not? And this is what the student will track their behavior. That's part of their intervention, is self-awareness and being aware. And then you have a good idea of when the student is engaging in behavior appropriately during different times of the day and when they're not. So we can really focus in where we need to work with that student. Really quick, I just want to talk about the PBISworld.com data tracking. And as you can see on this data sheet, there are bazillions of different resources for teachers. Includes ABC charts, scatter plot data, force surveys, functional assessment checklists, and so much more. So this is a great resource for data tracking. All right. So data collection is a key component of ABA and PBS and is necessary to see the behavior change and make effective decisions. Brittany, if you can go ahead and go with your arguments, or third one.
Similar to ABA, SWPBS places high importance on including the client and those closest to the client in the decision-making processes. One of the foundations of PBS is that it operates from a person-centered values base. The importance of person-centered planning and functional analysis in the PBS model is demonstrated throughout their procedures. Making decisions for the client without their input, as well as those closest to the client, would be against the BACB Code 2.03 consultation. The code states that behavior analysts arrange for appropriate consultations and referrals based principally on the best interests of their clients, with appropriate consent and subject to other relevant considerations, including applicable law and contractual obligations. PBS follows a similar code by following a structured treatment process for Tier 2 and Tier 3 students that are considered to be at risk. Tier 3 involves a process of identifying and providing highly individualized supports for high-level needs. The students in this tier include function-based behavioral interventions, FBA or BIPs, and person-centered plans. Person-centered plans focus on helping the individual to live the kind of life that he or she wants to live. PBS recognizes the importance of involving the client, but also places importance on involving the service providers and family members. Similar to the conjoint behavioral consultation of ABA, PBS creates a team including the client, professionals, and non-professionals closest to the client. This team is responsible for using person-centered planning to ensure that the goals outlined for the client are beneficial for the client. This is also the goal of the team during CBC when utilizing ABA practices during functional analysis. During both planning processes, emphasis is placed on making sure the client is getting positively involved in their school, home, and community life. The goals for the client should include developing and maintaining satisfying relationships, participating in productive and meaningful employment or educational opportunities, participating in recreational activities, and developing the skills necessary to function effectively in his or her community. Being able to effectively function in a community is a crucial part of life to learn. This is something that person-centered planning in SWPBS focuses on. While incorporating this into the PBS model, individuals are learning how to generalize behaviors in all settings. The conceptual framework of ABA includes concepts that seek to improve community-based outcomes. Some of these concepts include contextual fit, the role of relationships in intervention planning and implementation, increased reliance on social validity, and system variables related to replication and sustainability. These are the same concepts that person-centered planning take into consideration to ensure the overall life of an individual. SWPBS is a proactive approach to establishing and addressing behavior, which is a key component that make the two similar. To claim that there are no similarities between the two would be entirely inaccurate. PBS is an alternative to addressing behavior in a positive manner compared to punishment. It also relies heavily on data and identifying the function of behavior in order to address the behavior and see behavior change. And they both operate on a person-centered planning base. This multi-tiered framework incorporates reinforcement, contingency management, stimulus control, shaping, fading, prompting, functional analysis, generalization, and maintenance, which are the same concepts that make up the foundations of applied behavioral analysis. The data collection procedures of SWPBS are another component that can be used to prove the similarity between the two. The initial assessments and analysis of PBS that are completed prior to implementing the behavior change program are in compliance with the BACB Ethical Code 3.01 that assessments are conducted prior to making recommendations and when developing a behavior change program. This code is just one of the many of ethical codes that demonstrates the relationship between the two being nothing other than similar. Tara will now be sharing the rebuttal statements to our arguments.
It has been argued that PBS is similar to ABA in that it utilizes reinforcement procedures to teach appropriate behaviors as opposed to utilizing punishment contingencies. In response to this argument, we believe that the use of positive reinforcement alone does not mean that PBS and ABA are the same. While increasing appropriate functional behaviors may help provide an easier functional alternative to inappropriate behaviors and therefore cause a decrease in challenging behavior, positive reinforcement alone is not enough to cause this decrease. PBS does not take into account other strategies that can be utilized to decrease problem behaviors such as extinction or response blocking. It also does not take into consideration extreme behaviors that could result in injury that may need to be blocked or extinguished. It has also been argued that PBS relies on data collection just as ABA does. In response to this, while PBS may utilize some forms of data collection, it does not have the ethical standards related to data collection and use that is defined for behavior analysts in the BACB Code of Ethics. According to Anderson and Kincaid, PBS mostly utilizes the frequency of office referrals to determine whether or not its interventions are working. While the article tries to argue that this is a reliable measure as it records what the teacher may have directly observed, by using these written records over direct observation, there are multiple factors that may have been left out or gone unnoticed by teachers not trained in recording direct observations. Using office referrals as a measurement also does not give any feedback about the acquisition of appropriate behaviors that have been reinforced. In contrast, ABA practitioners utilize data collection methods that provide more information about behavior by using direct observation. At this time, I'm going to show some data sheets that are used in ABA. So as you can see here, this behavior sheet gives a little bit more of a thorough description of what is happening surrounding the behavior. So we have when the behavior is occurring, what activity is going on during the behavior, how long the observation was, the exact behavior itself. So in this case, it's hitting. And then we have a frequency count, and it also describes that this data was taken before the intervention. Here's another data sheet. This is an ABC data checklist. Again, we have when the behavior occurred, the task or demand that was placed on the individual. We have the antecedent, so what happened directly before the behavior occurred. So in cases there's a demand that's placed, or there could have been no demand placed, the individual could have been asking for something. We have the exact behavior that occurred, so throwing food on the floor, screaming, crying, kicking. And then we have the consequence, so what happened directly after the behavior. So whether a item was removed, the demand was followed through or was removed, or anything else that might have happened surrounding the behavior. The BACB Ethics Code not only requires data collection for all behavior change programs, but it requires the graphic display of data to further assist with data analysis. So now we're going to take a look at a graph. Here we can see data is being graphically analyzed. So we have on the bottom, we have the sessions going across. On the y-axis, we have the frequency of the behavior or the rate of behavior. The vertical lines represent phase change lines, so that's when a intervention was in place or not in place. So we have behavior occurring before the intervention, and then after the intervention is implemented, you can see that the behavior goes down, and then it goes back and forth. Okay. The BACB also requires the use of functional assessments when implementing behavior reduction programs, ensuring the function of behavior is clear. Without these safeguards, data can be misused or disregarded. And at this time, we're going to present our opening statement for our site. While PBS may have based some of its work from the behavioral principles, it is not the same as applied behavior analysis, and to say so is a detriment to the field of ABA. ABA focuses on applying behavioral principles in ways that can result in meaningful behavioral change through contingencies that alter the antecedents and consequences of behavior. ABA utilizes proper data collection and analysis, works to create generalizable changes to behavior, and utilizes the knowledge of professionals trained in the application of behavioral principles. In Ethics Code 2.09a, it is stated that clients have a right to effective treatment. PBS does not utilize the most effective, evidentially supported interventions, instead putting emphasis on the opinions of those who are untrained in the field. According to Anderson and Freeman, a key difference between PBS and other behavior-based interventions is in who gets more say in determining what behaviors and skills are going to be targeted with interventions. The article states that PBS relies on person-centered planning, which takes into consideration the opinions of the clients, the family, and friends, while ABA relies more heavily on the input of service providers who have been trained in the field. According to Johnson, Fox, Green, and Mullock, PBS uses social values to lead the selection of interventions for clients, while ABA focuses on evidence-based interventions that may have been proven successful and efficient for behavioral change by research, and then addresses those interventions in cultural contexts. Those without training in behavioral principles and interventions may unknowingly be reinforcing inappropriate behaviors or extinguishing appropriate replacement behaviors. Those trained in ABA are equipped to notice when this is occurring and to understand how to rearrange the environment to end unintentional reinforcement. By putting the opinions of those untrained in the field over those who have more extensive training, we are not utilizing the most effective evidence-based interventions. This is not to say that the opinions of those closest to the client do not matter at all. ABA programs often utilize treatment planning meetings in which goals are discussed with a treatment team composed of parents and caregivers as well as behavior analysts. The difference is the rhetoric of PBS puts the opinions of those untrained in the field above those of experts who rely on scientifically driven data to make informed decisions about care. By not relying first and foremost on evidence-based treatments, PBS is not in line with the ethics of ABA. For our second argument, we believe that PBS puts a lot of focus on changing the environment to suit the needs of the individual rather than teaching the individual skills that can be generalized to new environments. This has not led to an easy discontinuation of services. By choosing interventions that require significant adaptations to be made to the environment or having to do extensive training with all individuals who work with a client, it results in skill building that may not be generalizable outside of the targeted environment. So PBS focuses primarily on antecedent interventions, while the field of ABA places equal importance on altering antecedents and consequences of behavior in order to make behavioral changes. PBS often overutilizes alterations of the environment to accomplish its goals. In the Johnston article, it is noted that PBS often prescribes broad and general changes to the environment and gives examples in which problem behavior is discontinued due to such a change. This does not take into consideration environments that cannot be changed. One example given in the article is that it is an individual who participates in problem behavior when they are asked to do a less preferred activity that interferes with a more preferred activity. Instead of putting in place an intervention that might increase reinforcement for completing the less preferred activity, or an intervention that teaches functional communication skills so that the individual can communicate their activity preference, the PBS team just moved the less preferred activity to a time that it would not interfere. While in some cases, easy environmental changes like this might be the answer, most people encounter less preferred activities that they need to complete throughout the day. By not equipping the client with the tools to complete less preferred activities, they are not giving the client the ability to generalize their skill sets to new environments. This in itself can be restrictive, as the client may only learn to function in environments that have been altered to accommodate them. This also brings into question the Behavioral Ethics Code 4.11, which involves discontinuation of services after behavioral goals have been met and maintained. If a client does not learn behaviors that help them to interact with their environment that are maintainable and instead only relies on the environments that have been altered to accommodate them, they would not be able to meet lasting behavioral goals. This does not align with the necessity of meeting goals that will allow for discharge from a program as required in ABA. Therefore, PBS would not have achievable goals in place and that would allow for discharge from a PBS program. Now Nicole is going to present our last argument.
PBS is a new science, a separate science from ABA. It is a science that is influenced by multiple theoretical perspectives, which would fall under question Ethics Code 1.03, Maintaining Competence Through Professional Development. PBIS is a new science, a separate science from ABA, a science in its own. PBS is a science that is influenced by multiple theoretical perspectives. Combined elements of PBS comprise a fundamentally new science that helps reduce challenging behavior. Other behavior analysis have described PBS as a direct threat to ABA. It is believed to be because of its successful spread of PBS as a new science that will result in client rejection of ABA. PBS practitioners lack formal training in ABA, which may result in harmful effects for clients. It is also harmful to ABA due to being unscientific. PBS's interventions have been evaluated with non-rigorous designs such as anecdotal observations. Success of PBS threatens the distribution of ABA more than anecdotal evidence where there is some support for the claim. Per Carr and Sidner, PBS is being represented as a distinct discipline and had concluded that it is not considered ABA and should be considered to be separate than what many believed they should stay as one. PBS is referred to as comprehensive, proactive, flexible, and pragmatic, whereas ABA is referred to as traditional, which makes PBS not a part of ABA. PBS emphasizes on quality of life, normalization, and consumer choice. When having problems with practitioners, believing that one is considered if it is ABA related or not by extensive client confusion, disruptiveness within the professional community, and thinning the strength of the field in advancing broader goals. PBS being considered a new science goes against Ethics Code 1.03, Maintaining Competence Through Professional Development, which states that a behavior analyst maintain knowledge of current scientific and professional information in their areas of practice and undertake ongoing efforts to maintain competence in the skills they use by reading appropriate literature, attending conferences and conventions, participating in workshops, obtaining additional coursework, and/or obtaining and maintaining appropriate professional credentials. By not reading the recent research and study based on PBS being considered a new science and in its own category and not receiving the proper training. It states that ABA is not following and maintaining the knowledge of current scientific and professional information. Although they may attend conferences and workshops, it does not mean that they maintain competence through professional development appropriately. PBS may have taken elements from behavioral principles, but PBS and ABA are not one and the same. PBS is not effective, nor does it utilize the most effective treatments. PBS is not a part of ABA. It is detrimental to the field of ABA by saying that it is. PBS relies on skills to target and which interventions would be best fit to use. PBS relies on person-centered planning that help them to determine the characteristics of service based on the opinions of the clients, their families, and their friends, whereas ABA relies more heavily on the input of the service providers who have been trained in the field. PBS puts focus on changing the environment to help suit the needs of the individual rather than teaching the individual the skills that could be generalized to the new environments. PBS is also a new science. It is harmful to ABA and is unscientific because of PBS's interventions that are evaluated with non-rigorous designs. PBS is non-technical and it diminishes the effectiveness of interventions. Practitioners are not properly trained for PBS and do not implement them properly nor effectively. PBS focuses on development of their skills rather than addressing the problem behavior individually, thus making PBS and ABA not one and the same. Jenny will now begin Team A's rebuttal on our arguments.
Hi, so really quickly, I just wanted to go back to what Tara was discussing about how PBS changes the environment. So instead of having the individual adapt to the environment, PBS does change the environment. I'm sorry, she argued that PBS changes and that it does not align with ABA principles. And I would have to agree with her that ultimately it does. PBS is a transition to a different approach to addressing behavior and a way of thinking. For so many years, it has been common for individuals to respond to behavior in a negative way and attempt to punish the bad behavior. According to rhetoric, teachers implement a PBS approach into their classrooms to manipulate antecedents and consequences to increase desired behaviors. PBS takes a proactive approach to addressing behaviors by shaping the individual's behaviors and teaching students what is appropriate. Following along the multi-tiered framework of PBS, accommodations and supports are provided to students in schools so they can access the same educational environment as their peers in the least restrictive environment. These accommodations and supports allow the students to be successful in those environments. It is in the best interest to eventually fade these accommodations and supports if the data demonstrates that the students is showing success as to not become reliant on the supports. These supports to individualized interventions follows the BACB Ethical Code 4.03, individualized behavioral change programs that behavior analysts individualized behavior change programs, in this case PBS, to unique behaviors, environmental variables, assessment results, and goal of each client. Brittany, if you can do your argument or your rebuttal.
I think it was Nicole who also mentioned in her arguments that PBS is not effective and it does not utilize the most effective, evidentially supported interventions. And in response to that, I think that we proved that PBS utilizes a data collection procedure that can be broken down into several phases. As seen by the visuals shared by Jenny, there are quite a few similarities between the data collection forms used for Tier 2 and Tier 3 students in SWPBS and procedures of ABA. Using data, the SWPBS makes decisions and decides upon interventions that are tailored to each individual, which again is in compliance with the BACB Ethical Code 4.03, Individualized Behavior Change Program. You will see both theories utilizing ways to identify the function of the behavior, as well as to monitor progress. The emphasis of Tier 2 and Tier 3 students is to monitor progress, which proves its effectiveness by students going back to Tier 1 interventions. These phases are extremely detailed in order for client decisions to be made based on clear evidence from the data. There is clear documentation for why decisions were made, as well as how the behavior is changing in relation to the interventions. It is impossible for one to state that SWPBS is not effective when there is clear documentation of its effectiveness through the detailed data collection procedures. It was also mentioned by your team about the principles and framework of PBS, which brings me to a question for Team B. How are the dimensions of applied behavioral analysis identified by Bear, Wolf, and Risley differ from the principles of framework laid down by PBS?
One dimension of the ABA mentioned by Bear, Wolf, and Risley is that it is technological. This means that behaviors are clearly defined as well as intervention protocols so that they can be easily replicated. I argue that PBS does not utilize the same level of technology in their interventions as ABA programs do. ABA also includes the dimension of generality, which allows programs to generalize so that the client can function in new and appropriate environments. PBS interventions do not lend to easy generalization due to how heavily they use alteration of the environment. PBS is not conceptually consistent with behavioral principles as it focuses mainly on principles of reinforcement and does not address other principles of behavior, including extinction. In order for PBS to be more conceptually consistent, it would require all of those who practice PBS to have a more solid background in these principles. And now we have a question for Team A. Are PBIS and individual intervention plans for student behavior mutually exclusive, and do they need to be?
By saying these interventions are mutually exclusive, one would be saying that the interventions cannot occur simultaneously. This statement would be false, as they can occur simultaneously, and research supports this claim. PBS interventions are intended to improve an individual's overall quality of life. The interventions may sometimes be in addition to a specific area of life that an individual is exhibiting problem behaviors. For example, an individual may have a behavior plan from their IEP to address one challenging behavior in the classroom, while there is an additional intervention plan developed from PBS for an individual when they go out into the community or when they're transitioning in the hallways. Interventions based on a PBS framework often involve multiple strategies, many, if not most, of which are drawn directly from applied behavior analysis. Anderson and Freeman state that a comprehensive intervention will include multiple components. Claiming that an individual interventions need to be mutually exclusive would be in direct violation of the research, and states interventions should be composed of multiple components. Jenny will now be going into Team A's closing statements.
Positive Behavior Supports is an initiative in schools that applies principles and strategies derived from applied behavior analysis to prevent problem behaviors by analyzing the function of behavior and teaching behavioral expectations and reinforcing alternative behaviors appropriate in the school environment. This process followed by the PBS are very similar to the components of applied behavior analysis, being that PBS applies principles and strategies derived from ABA. One can see how they are similar in how they address behaviors. As stated in our arguments, PBS is in compliance with numerous BACB codes, including Code 4.08, Considerations Regarding Punishment Procedures, Code 3.01, Behavior Analytics Systems, Code 2.03, Consultation, Code 4.03, Individualized Behavior Change Programs. These codes and PBS are in compliance with improved similarity of the core foundations of PBS and ABA. Both of these practices focuses on changing behaviors in a positive manner. Following a system approach for addressing behavior, establish a cohesive consultation process and place a high importance on individualization when addressing behaviors. These four examples are foundations of both PBS and ABA, and having these foundations in common are proof of the similarity between.
Okay, for our closing statement, PBS, which is Positive Behavior Supports, is not applied behavior analysis. Although PBS may have based some of their work from principles of behavior, it is still not considered to be ABA. Based on ethics codes such as 2.09, clients have the right to effective treatment, 4.11, involving the discontinuation of services after behavioral goals have been met and maintained, and 1.03, maintaining competence through professional development, proves that PBS is not an effective treatment, nor does it utilize the most effective and evidentially supported interventions. Those who do not have training in behavioral principles and interventions may unknowingly be reinforced the inappropriate behaviors when they may feel that they are doing what they are supposed to. PBS avoids problematic behaviors individually and focuses on its development of skills instead. PBS also tries to focus on changing the environment to suit the needs of the individual instead of teaching the individual skills that can be generalized in new environments. The science is influenced by multiple theoretical perspectives. PBS emphasizes the quality of life, normalization, and consumer choice. PBS is a new science. Practitioners and behaviorists believe that PBS is harmful to ABA. This is because of the fear that PBS practitioners lack the formal training of ABA, which may result in harmful effects to clients. Yes, PBS may utilize behavioral principles. However, PBS is not effective and is not a part of applied behavior analysis, thus making it not one and the same.
Today, you heard two very different opinions on the relationship between SWPBS and ABA. Jennifer and myself shared our beliefs of the topic, arguing that the relationship between the two are not necessarily one and the same, but very similar. Some of these similarities include that PBS is an alternative to addressing behavior in a positive manner compared to first resorting to punishment. It relies heavily on data and identifying the function of behavior in order to address the behavior and see behavior change. And they both operate on a person-centered planning base. On the other side, you heard from Nicole and Tara, claiming that the relationship between ABA and SWPBS is not the same because PBS does not utilize the most effective and evidentially supported interventions. Their arguments included that PBS does not utilize the most effective evidentially supported interventions. It puts a lot of focus on changing the environment to suit the needs of the individual rather than teaching the individual skills that can be generalized to new environments. And that PBS is a new science, a separate science from ABA that has evolved from multiple theoretical perspectives. As we conclude this debate, we challenge you to take the time to consider the statements mentioned in the arguments, as well as the fundamental components and processes of school-wide positive behavior and ABA, and decide for yourself what the relationship between the two are. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to the future discussions with all of you.